Today we're diving into a story that's unfolding right now. Imagine a single waterway shuts down, and suddenly one of the world's biggest economies is on the ropes, forced into a dangerous energy pivot. A single choke point is closed, and the shockwaves, they could cripple the Indian economy. Let's break down what's happening.
Okay, so our story starts right here, in this pretty narrow stretch of water. This is the Strait of Hormuz, separating Iran and Oman. It might not look like much on a map, but this little channel is, and I am not exaggerating here, one of the most critical spots on the entire planet. And it's all about one thing: energy.
And that's really the heart of what we're digging into today. The flow of oil and gas through this strait has, for all intents and purposes, just stopped. Not because of a physical blockade, but because the risk is just too high. And that suspension is sending massive shockwaves all the way to India, a country that relies on this waterway for its economic lifeblood.
So to really get why this is such a huge deal for India, we first need to zoom in on the waterway itself. Let's talk about why the Strait of Hormuz has got the entire world holding its breath. The numbers here are just mind-boggling. The Strait of Hormuz is, officially, the world's most important oil choke point. Think about that for a second. About a fifth, that's 20% of all the petroleum and all the natural gas the entire world uses has to pass through this tiny gap. It is a superhighway for tankers.
So what exactly happened? Well, after a series of threats tied to the conflict in West Asia, the people who own the ships, the people who own the cargo, and the companies that insure these billion-dollar assets, they all did the math. And they decided the risk of sending their tankers through the strait was just too high. So they've pulled back. The oil is still there, but the highway is effectively closed for business.
And with that highway closed, we get to India, a country whose energy security is now, well, hanging by a thread. To really see why, let's put some numbers to it and quantify just how massive this dependency really is.
First, get this number in your head: 88%. India is the third biggest oil user on the planet, but it barely produces any of its own. So a colossal 88% of all the oil it needs, it has to import.
And here is where it gets really dicey. Of all that oil that India is importing, about half of it, 50%, has to sail right through the Strait of Hormuz, right through the choke point that's now closed.
To put that percentage into real terms, we are talking about almost 2.7 million barrels of oil every single day. This is the oil coming from their key suppliers in the Gulf, places like Iraq, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and all of it is now at risk. So when half your supply chain is suddenly disrupted, you have to pivot, and you have to do it fast. So where do you turn? Well, the most immediate available alternative seems to be Russia. But that, as you can imagine, is a complicated choice.
So why Russia? Well, it really just comes down to logistics and sheer availability. Russia has plenty of oil ready to sell. And even better, there are already tankers full of Russian crude just sitting in the Indian Ocean and the Arabian Sea. Some of it is even in what they call floating storage, basically giant mobile warehouses on the water. We're talking 10 million barrels, right there, ready to be rerouted. That gives India some immediate breathing room.
And here's the really crucial part. India had actually been buying less Russian oil recently. It dropped from a peak of over 2 million barrels a day down to around 700,000. Now, that might sound bad, but in a crisis like this, it's actually great news. It means India has a ton of proven, available capacity to ramp those imports right back up again and fast.
Okay, so it seems like problem solved, right? India has some of its own oil saved up in strategic reserves, and it has a major supplier in Russia ready to fill the gap. So, its energy supply is secure then? Well, not so fast. The answer is way more complicated than it looks.
Because the real story here, the hidden crisis that nobody is talking about, it's not actually about the oil at all. It's about the gas.
Let's just put them side by side. For crude oil, it's a huge global market, it's flexible. India has its own emergency reserves to manage shocks, and there are lots of different countries they can buy from. But for LPG, that's the cooking gas many people use, and LNG, which is used for power plants and industry, it is a completely different world. India has no big strategic reserves of these, the global market for them is tiny, and, you guessed it, they are dangerously reliant on those exact same Gulf suppliers who are now cut off.
And these numbers are absolutely stark. India imports a staggering 80 to 85% of all the LPG it uses. For LNG, something like 60% of its imports come right through that now closed strait. This isn't just a weakness, it's a massive, concentrated vulnerability. As one analyst put it so perfectly, and this is really the main takeaway from all this, LPG is India's bigger vulnerability. The oil problem, it's manageable, at least for a while. But a shortage of gas, that's a much more immediate and much more painful crisis to solve.
So what happens next? Where does India and, frankly, the global energy market go from here? Well, the entire situation, everything, hinges on one single, completely unpredictable variable.
And that variable is duration. How long does this disruption last? A few days? A week? A month? Every single risk calculation, every prediction about price spikes and supply shortages, it all comes down to that simple question of time. For crude oil, India has a cushion. For the first week or so, they can use existing fuel stocks. For the next 10 days after that, they can use the crude oil already at their refineries. And if things get really bad, they can tap their strategic reserves. But here's the crunch. Those deep buffers, those layers of defense, they just don't exist for LPG and LNG. The safety net there is much, much smaller.
And that leaves us with this final, critical question. This crisis in the Strait of Hormuz has exposed that India's real energy vulnerability isn't what most people thought. Now that we all know the real weak point is gas, not oil, how long can that far more fragile safety net truly hold?